me when lunch came.
Thank you.
It was at one time the well, the first time I played dinner together.
That's great.
Oh, yeah.
So you started cutting up jobs already, something like that.
Thank you for coming.
On behalf of the Board of Directors at Kelly House, we welcome all of you here today for our 31st history talk. It's really a conversation with the audience. And so we're very privileged today to have Tom Ugrin here to talk about his dad, and who was Leo Ugrin, a very outstanding deputy sheriff who worked together with Mendocino's Sam Costa. And reading through your scrapbook, I was very impressed with what he did and all the commendations that were given to him and all the awards. And so he was an outstanding deputy sheriff, and he gave 21 years, I believe it was, to service, you know, in that way, and to the county and to the coast. And he was always very concerned with all the people that he was representing. So it is my pleasure to welcome you today to talk about your dad.
Is it, can you see here?
Oh, and I also want to say that it is being videotaped by MCTV, and after it's broadcast, the tapes will be available for purchase.
Hard to know where to start, but maybe give you a little of our family history. My parents and I, as an infant, moved to Fort Bragg, I think in 1946, 47. Memory's a little hazy because I was about a year old at the time. But, my grandparents had retired from Montana and come down, and they were part of the Finnish community in Fort Bragg. And my mother, at some point, got very angry with my dad and packed up baby and her car and came to California. And then a short time later, my dad came down. And I don't know if you're familiar with the way the coast operated on those days, but Fort Bragg was kind of a closed community in a lot of ways. And really the major employer here was the Union Lumber Company. And the only way you could get employment in the Union Lumber Company was to have family there. They really didn't want outsiders coming in. So you're chuckling there, so you're aware of that too. And since my father didn't have family there, he got a job as a plumber, I think, for Kempy's hardware store, which was on Main Street. And during during the Korean War, a lot of the vets were called back, and all of a sudden they had a labor shortage. So he got a job in the mill, and when working there, he became acquainted with Reno Bartolome, who later became the sheriff. And I think in the election in 1954-55, my father campaigned for him, so the jobs in those days were patronage jobs. There were no civil service attached to it, so Dad went out and canvassed the town, and by that point in time, he was pretty well known around Fort Bragg. And one thing led to another. He ended up, hi Lance, getting the job after Reno was elected. And his initial partner was a man named Norman Cook. I think they were here for about 2 years together, and then Norman moved on to bigger and better things. And then Sam Costa, who was Reno Bartolome's brother-in-law, got the second deputy's job. Again, patronage jobs. And the two of them were just pretty much inseparable, sort of like Mutt and Jeff. Sam was kind of short, stocky, had a real fiery temper. My father was larger than I am, and a big man, and a little bit calmer. And the two of them just sort of clicked together, and they were paired up at that point. And at that time, very few deputies, you know, in Mendocino County. So they had everything from Leggett to Point Arena. That's what they were responsible for. And they, I know the initial patrol car he got was like a 1950 Hudson, no radios. And we had a, you know, our phone was listed in the phone book. So when people wanted to call the deputy, they just called our house. And as a child, we got some of the damnedest calls from people. It just make your hair stand up on edge. People would call in the middle of the night, 3 in the morning, looking for their husband that they thought was drunk somewhere. There were a couple of spinsters up north of town, Fraser, Hetty, and I can't remember the other ones, but there were a couple of retired school teachers in their 80s and deep into dementia. And they would, the first calls we got from them were, my father got a call about 3 in the morning, and a woman screaming in the phone, they're killing my sister, while he's running around the house, getting his gun and getting in the car and driving up to 10 Mile, getting to the old Fraser Ranch, which I think was actually part of the old Roberts Ranch, just above Seaside, and just knock on the door and got met by an old lady with a shotgun. and I remember getting one of those calls myself, and somehow the old ladies were fixated on the fact that some of the kids were after them. And I think probably from teaching school I'll probably go through the same thing, having spent 25 years in the classroom. When I get into my dotage, I'll probably go the same direction. But I remember getting a call, and again, they would call like at 1 or 2 or 3 in the morning, and I'm not sure why I ended up answering the phone, except maybe my folks were asleep, but same thing. Kids are here and they've thrown our pump in the well, and need to get up there right now. And they would call all over the place. They would call Ukiah, and until everybody really figured out what they were all about, there were some real wild goose chases there. But in those days, the deputies were on call 24 hours a day. And sometimes when things would happen, you wouldn't see the old man for 2-3 days. When they had the flood in the 50s and in the 60s, they were gone for like 2 weeks. Just out, they got sent over by the Eel River to rescue people and that sort of thing. It wasn't 8 hours on the clock. It was just something came up, you had to go. And it was kind of an interesting time. Law enforcement in those days was a great deal different than now. Today it's, Lance is laughing. But what I'd call more like a personal kind of law enforcement. I think they took their job seriously, but they weren't real serious about it. And people I think that had contact with my father and Sam could attest to that. They enjoyed the work. They did it very well. And again, the community was more homogenous in those days, so they knew who all the guys were that did stuff. And for most years, their crime clearance record, I mean, if there were 100 crimes and misdemeanors and felonies reported, they solved all 100 of them. Today, the average crime clearance rate for law enforcement is down around 30 or 40%, but for years, theirs was 100% and better. Sometimes they solved crimes that hadn't been reported, so it was really more than 100%. And when crimes were reported, they'd say, oh, well, that sounds like Sam, and they'd go over to Sam's house, and sure as heck, it was Sam. I recall one instance where someone's brother-in-law said, they're going to break into the Beacon gas station tonight in Fort Bragg. And you guys can remember where the Beacon station was. So my father was waiting for him. And 2 guys get in, and they're breaking in, and they had a floor safe, and they're sitting there with a hammer and chisel trying to get the safe out of the floor. And my father steps out of the back room and says, hello, boys, and just about wet themselves. So he cultivated people in a lot of ways, and I think that he didn't look at people as just criminals. They were human individuals. And so people, he had a great range of informants in the community. People would come to him and say, my brother did something, my uncle or my friend, and criminals generally talk, you know, nobody keeps their mouths shut. And everything would kind of filter back. People would call the house at odd hours. You know, you'd have these phone conversations and off you'd go and come back with somebody in handcuffs. So it was really an interesting time as a kid. And then, of course, as I got older, it became a little less interesting as I became in my teenage years, because one of the problems about having a father who's a law enforcement officer in a small town is you can't get away with anything. My friend Bill Brazil attests to that, because he and I tried a lot. We got reeled in a great deal. But I think, again, it was a perfect job for my father at the right time of the world. Like I said, it was more of a personal kind of law enforcement. Those days, if they caught a drunk driver, a lot of times they just parked his car and took him home. You know, it wasn't, you know, doing all the paperwork and throwing the guy in jail overnight. Some of the things that they did were like that. They take criminals under their wing sometimes. I recall that we had a fellow that stored his car at our house. The guy was down on his luck, broke up with his wife, was drinking his way across the country. My father caught him for drunk driving, and he was so drunk he had to take him to jail. And the guy didn't have any place, he didn't have any money, didn't have a place to leave his car, so he said, could you know, someone could store my car? I said, well, I would just put it in my yard when you get out. And they gave him a year in a can. So 11 or 12 months later, he gets out, and of course he's broke, has no place to go, his car's at our house. So my dad ended up transporting back to Fort Bragg, and we had a bunkhouse right outside our house. And so he found the fellow a job with Ed Kane, who had the sheet metal shop. The guy had been a sheet metal worker, moved into our bunkhouse, and lived with us for about 3 years there. And that's the kind of law enforcement, it just doesn't exist anymore. But a lot of people he helped out along the way. It wasn't just arrest somebody, throw them in jail, it was try to get them to reform or change their ways or give up drinking or something like that. But more of a personal interest. Now I think law enforcement's very impersonal. Law enforcement officers do it in kind of a military fashion. Those people didn't in those days. And it was a very fascinating time for me as a kid. I brought my dad's first badge here along with me. It's kind of my keepsake. And this was what you didn't want to run into. This was actually my grandfather's sap. And it's got a spring-loaded handle and about a half a pound of lead in the head of it. I had never known my father to hit anybody with this thing. You know, he generally just calmed people down by his presence. And he had a certain reputation before he went to work as a law enforcement officer as being one of the toughest guys around this area. And he had been a boxer when he was younger, so he was a pretty fearsome individual if you got him riled up. But I don't know what else I can add to it.
Could you talk a little bit about, when you were talking about the territory that they covered? I know you mentioned Leggett, but at that time, there was a community of Wolf Creek, with Wheeler, and that, you had to go up into that country too.
Wolf Creek, yeah.
And Rockport, and
Yeah.
you touch upon those
Yeah.
communities that, you know,
Don't exist anymore. Bill's referring to Rockport, which in Wolf Creek. Rockport's just kind of a bump in the road now as you go north on Highway 1. But in the 50s and up until the early 60s was really a thriving community. They had a large lumber mill and a real kind of rough and tumble group of people that lived there. And then Wolf Creek was above, actually off the highway, gosh, it must be about 20 miles or 30 miles inland. And another spot was just, had been a cove there at one point. Somebody built a sawmill. And so they had to go there. And in both of those communities, this is pre-TV, no other entertainment. They both had roadhouses where we went on Friday and Saturday night, got drunk and brawled. And I know my father, every Saturday night, he ended up in Rockport, and invariably had to haul 2 or 3 guys back with them. You know, it's pretty much just what
You have to
occurred
make a
here.
stop at Long Creek and maybe pick up one of the McMahons on the way.
Yeah.
You know, because they might have the roadblock charging tolls or something up there.
Yeah, the early days, when we were talking about it before we started filming him, but up until, gosh, was it 1954, 55? Fort Bragg was, during Paul Bunyan's day, Labor Day celebration, was really an open community where they suspended a lot of the civil ordinances, so you could gamble, you could drink 24 hours a day.
Carry loaded weapons
Yeah.
downtown.
Just, it was real wild and woolly, and you had a lot of loggers that came after World War II, and people that work in woods even after the Korean War. A lot of them lived out in camps, a lot of them were single, hadn't married at that point, and just Friday nights was having a good time. So anyway, they would have these roadhouses. The one in Rockport was just, my father had some incredible stories there. One fellow getting in a rough and tumble with one of his cousins, bit his ear off. And my father was telling a story, the guy comes to him with his ear in his hand like this and says, "Look, look." He said, "He bit my ear off."
Jesus.
And my father said to him, "Well, I saw what you did, and you had it coming." So he ended up handcuffing the two together and throwing them both in jail that night. And I don't know if what they did with his ear. And I believe that was one of the McMahons who did that.
I believe so, actually. I know that story from your son, yeah. Because he thought he was pretty tough when I bit his ear off.
Yeah.
So,
Those are the kind of things that occurred. It wasn't the kind of thing you see on Miami Vice or something like that. Crimes in those days, I think, were fairly minor. I could only remember 1 or 2 murders in my whole life here on the coast until probably 20 years ago.
right.
It's
Well, I
certainly
mean, Bill
more-
tells the story about when, we of course, we gave the little talk to
Yeah.
Bill that outlaw, so, what was it, they poached a skiff that time or something, where,
Oh,
I think Sam might have gone over to check on that one, you know, as they always knew who the culprits were and everything. But I thought something that, I've been really curious, you know, for years. I wanted to ask you specifically about what happened to the bear hide and who got the bear skull from the big grizzly bear.
Yeah, the only bear hide that I remember around was one my father had shot in Montana and of course, had it mounted in
No,
on the wall.
I'm just saying specifically that one. I remember that
Oh,
as a
that
kid, that was a Boone and Crockett.
Yeah,
That was a Boone and Crockett bear. I remember he had the skull on the coffee table
yeah.
and the hide on the wall.
Yeah,
And it was Boone and Crockett. It was the second largest grizzly bear ever killed in Montana.
it actually was a black bear, but it
Was it a
was
black-
probably the biggest black bear
Ever killed.
shot.
Yeah, it was Boone and
Yeah.
Crockett. It's record.
Yeah, my sister actually has that one hanging on her wall now.
Really?
Yeah, she made her move a little quicker than I did to get some
Uh-huh.
of this stuff.
But the skull was there too. Because
Yeah.
they took the skull out of the mount. The mount has an artificial skull.
Yeah,
in it. I was
right,
wondering
it's
who
stuff.
got the skull. The
You know, I'm sure my sister probably has that
skull
too.
was awesome.
Yeah.
It used to sit on the coffee table. Because
Huge
we'd
bear.
go there for a sauna.
Yeah,
Because I was saying, you know, it was interesting because Leo was the deputy, but I remember specifically one night having an abalone dinner there. That might not have exactly been abalone season or something. And we were, you know, everybody was there drinking and the sauna was hot.
yeah,
And the bunkhouse was a cool place. You know, you guys were the only people that had a bunkhouse at that
Yeah.
time, so it was a pretty cool thing.
yeah, I actually ended up living in there as I got into my teenage years, and again, it was difficult, you know, Lance and Bill both know, when you grow up in Fort Bragg in the 50s and 60s, you know, it was beer and wine every Friday and Saturday night, and sitting around a fire someplace on the beach or up the creek somewhere, and boy, it was really tough getting things over on my dad, because, you know, I'd see him the next day and he'd say, "Well, I heard you were up at 10 Mile, and you were really drunk last night, and I'm really disappointed in you. I said, where did you hear that? I said, I heard that. And I guess one of the things that came with it is that, is that when you were the cop's kid, people had to tell on you, because he'd go out and break up somebody else's party the next weekend, and then he'd say, well, your kid was here. I don't know, a lot of nights we rolled into the bunkhouse. Bill remembers those nights.
Well,
If you can remember that before.
I only remember the time we were heading back to the bunkhouse one night, and your dad happened to be heading to town, and he put him in the ditch. We scuttled back to the bunkhouse and piled under the covers, and your dad came in.
It was a little on the cranky side, yeah. Well, we had a little too much to drink there, I think.
Talk a little bit maybe about, growing up, it was Pudding Creek, wasn't it?
Yeah.
What life was like in Pudding Creek?
Yeah, well, Pudding Creek was a community. Simpson Lane was a community, Noya was a community. This is, again, pre-TV days, one kind of broken down radio station here in the Advocate News, which never has been worth much. Each one of these little communities had a hall. Pudding Creek had a hall, and everybody would get together there. They'd have dances. I mean, going to dances, I think probably, those that were in the generations just before mine, you certainly can remember that was the high point of the social life around this area at that time. So they would have dances out there, barbecues.
Where was the hall?
It's just up the road from my mother's house, on the
Still
left
there?
side. Yeah, it's still there. I think that Jeff's mother.
Jeff's mother.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Gail Jeeves, I
Gave us
think
a
owns it.
Gail Bowman.
Yeah.
But Pudding Creek was a chicken area.
No, it is,
Yeah.
Old Petaluma.
Yeah, well, I think Fort Bragg in general, the hinterlands out here were chicken ranches. Of course, when my mother came to California, she borrowed some money from my grandparents who had retired here. Little bit of the family history, my mother and my grandparents were part of the Finnish community here. My grandfather had actually been here someplace in the 1800s, I think on his first trip to the States, and he went back to Finland and then went to Montana and homesteaded. But my grandfather had a number of cousins around the area, and so around 1930, just before the Depression really kicked off, he sold a farm and a ranch. He had a farm and a ranch, and moved to Lincoln Street in Fort Bragg. And so my mother ended up coming down here and bought this chicken farm. So my mother worked for the phone company at that point, and we raised chickens, which was, for a kid, not a heck of a lot of fun.
Well, I was gonna ask you to mention, your mom, she worked at the phone exchange with my mother.
Right,
They were night operators
Yeah.
on the phone exchange.
right.
And so, of course, I've heard lots of stories about Bertha, and I used to go there when I was a kid. They'd open the little window and
Oh,
let you
yeah.
in through the security door.
Right,
And we'd go in there, but Fort Bragg at that point, when your mother and my mother were working there, it had the last magnetic drop phone board in California. And in those days, in the 50s, still, when you picked up your phone and you wanted to call, when you picked it up, your wire fell off the ceiling. And then they'd say Kelly McGuire, and you'd stick it in and turn the crank and give it the right number of cranks so that Kelly would pick up his phone, or whoever was out on the Willits Road line. And on the Willits Road, it was an 8-party line. I mean, it was a big deal to get on the phone. You'd have to wait your turn to make a phone call in those days. And so my mother told about the night that your mother and she were working and it started to snow. They were looking out the little window. And she said every wire fell off of the board. It's just dropped down, and they just tried to hook a few people up, and then they just plugged everybody in to everybody else, and everybody in Fort Bragg was talking to everybody else about the snow coming down that night. So it was a different different time.
Really a different time, and you knew everyone in town, and you knew everybody's business in town. Because they not only just plugged in, but I think they listened to a lot
They
of
plugged in, they literally plugged in.
Yeah, depending on how interesting the conversation was.
Yeah.
And I know when I was young, probably the Korean War era, we were on a 4-party line out
Yeah.
there. And it was, I know when we first got a single party phone, it was really a big deal.
That was a big deal.
You know, that, and your neighbors didn't get to find out what you were up to. Rose?
What kind of commendations and things did your father get? And did he meet any really interesting people?
Well, I think mostly interesting people were criminals of one kind or another. You know, he got commendations because he was probably one of the only people in the state that, like I alluded to earlier, that actually had 100% of the crimes that were reported were solved. And I know that at one point my daughter went to work for the sheriff's office here, and you know, they still kind of talk about him there as you know, he was just the right man in the right job in the right place at the right time. You know, he loved to work. I mean, he never went out the door grumpy. He always enjoyed going out to go to work, and he really enjoyed catching people and stuff, including his son and friends and stuff.
Yeah, well, he was a real human being, though. I mean,
Yeah.
like you alluded to, I mean, a lot of drunks got a ride home.
Yeah,
You know, a lot of people might get a second chance. Maybe if you caught them in the act, they might get a chance to renege on the act
Yeah.
and promise not to do it again.
yeah, and they even worked with the local judge, it was Judge Ware here at the
Oh,
time.
well, yeah.
And, I mean, they literally, some people, they actually ran out of Fort Bragg. I won't mention the names, because some of them were still around the county, but it was a different kind of law enforcement, and probably a more, like, the only reason, the way I can describe it is kind of a personal way of doing things. And they applied some discretion. I was just thinking, kind of going back through my memory about, there were 2 brothers in Fort Bragg who stole everything that wasn't nailed down. And one of them broke into the Casper post office when there was a post office there. And my father, as soon as they saw, you know, the crime, the way he broke the window, he knew who it was. He called the guy in, sat him down, and said, "I know you did it." "Oh, no, I didn't do it." "I know you did it." I said, "I didn't do it." My father said, "I know you did it because I've got your fingerprints." And the guy said, "You couldn't have, I wore gloves." And then chagrin. But he just knew how things were done, who did them. And if he didn't, in very short order, he found out who did it. But it really was an interesting time, and like I said, it was just a different era. Some of the things they did, a police officer could get fired for now. If you took home a drunk, and
Well, but you really touched on why his system works so well, is that because in that era, too, people didn't tolerate people stealing chainsaws. They
Yeah.
didn't want to have to lock their front door. They didn't feel like they should have to lock their pickup truck. And so it was much better to have a Leo Ugrin, who you could call up and say, how about doing something about
Yeah.
this? And the thing is that he would do, it made the impersonal part of law enforcement now also means that you don't have that whole group of support people
right,
who know that you're not going to take it out of the ballpark, you're gonna do the appropriate thing, you're gonna, try and, mitigate it the best way. Law enforcement doesn't have that, so they
No.
have to go it alone, so it's unbending.
yeah, it is unbending, and it's a real rigid kind of process. And I think, he looked at the job as not only as arresting miscreants, but also trying to reform them. And, you know, and he spent a lot of time with a lot of people trying to get him back on but basically the straight and narrow path.
Was hauled up at the Comchi store, do you know anything about that?
Well, it just, you know, actually, that was probably, you know, the newspaper article was more of a big thing than it really was, you know. You know, it's one of those things where, you know, these guys were armed, but I think they were drunk also when they did that. And as soon as they found out, you know, the crime and had the description of it, it was just going in, literally picking them up. I think my father only a couple times in his career actually, I think he discharged a firearm once when they had an escaped convict stole a dump truck of all things. And the guy would come out of the dump truck, so they fired a shot over the roof, the guy bailed out on the road. And then he had a domestic dispute once that he went to, and the guy came to the door with I think it was a Luger in his hand, and shot right next to my father's foot. He said, "Beat it." Whereupon he beat it. And they, you know, it was one of those things where they called him on the phone and talked to him until he sobered up.
Tom,
Arrested him.
I was interested when I was reading the scrapbook about the robbery at the Cooney Tavern.
Yeah.
Because I grew up in Comshi, and I knew Mr. and Mrs. Cooney, and their daughter is here today, Lorna Cooney Chance. So if you want to say anything about that, Lorna? Your memory of it? Or
No.
a memory like from your parents?
It was a big deal. When somebody, you know, stands right in your face with a shotgun, it is a big deal.
Yeah.
So,
What year was that?
probably 61, 62, something like that, I would think.
Yeah,
I'm just guessing.
It's something my father really didn't even discuss much other than it's just what he did, you know.
Yeah.
Just, I mean,
And they took the keys, all of my mom, you know, they had a big ring of keys, and they threw them over the bridge at Big River. They went to Casper and paid a bar bill at the Casper Hotel.
it bucks, right?
Yep, that's right.
Didn't you say once he picked up was it Jim Jones?
Oh, that was when my father at one point was working out of Ukiah. I don't know if you recall Jim Jones, who took all these people down to Guyana and they all committed suicide. Jim Jones was a preacher that actually moved to Redwood Valley from Oakland. And my father had occasion to be going up through Redwood Valley and he saw this limousine. The guy had a big black Cadillac, and he just noticed as he drove up to it, he stopped because it was just kind of broken down along the road, and he said he see these hands going like this in here. And so he stopped and got out, and it's Jim Jones, whose car broke down, and he thought it was some conspiracy, and he was hiding in the, man was obviously insane at that point too, but he was hiding in the back seat laying on the floor, and when my father came up with the patrol car, it was like deliverance. And so my father picked him up and settled him down. I guess he was almost incoherent. Took him up to his compound, and he said when you drove into this compound that they had, he said there were people there with machine guns. I mean, this is how, you know, the paranoia was widespread through that whole thing. And 2 or 3 weeks later, the sheriff's office was just deluged with letters from all of his followers. And there must have been several hundred of them. And they were pretty much like somebody wrote it on the blackboard, and they all wrote the same letter. And one of the interesting things, I you know, after the Jonestown thing went down, I read back through them. And the one guy who did some of the murders out at the airport was a guy named Larry Layton, and he had a very effusive letter he'd written and signed it. But my father was really taken aback by Jones. I remember him coming home and saying, boy, those people were all nuts. Which, you know,
They were.
held out, yeah.
So what was the slant of the letter? I didn't get what direction.
Well,
it
it was a letter basically praising my father, what a great law enforcement officer he was, and what a credit to the community, and it just, I obviously made some huge impression on Jones that he kind of got rescued, but, I mean, I remember my father talking about it, and Jones was just sure somebody had sabotaged his car and they were gonna come along and murder him, and, you know, I don't know what his background was before that, other than being a preacher, but he was definitely out there someplace on the end of a limb. So,
Did Sam and your dad, did they have different shifts, or did they work together, or did they have different territories? It seemed like, didn't Sam sort of cover the south end, your dad the north end, or how did?
after they got 2 patrol cars, when they started out together, they had 1 car. And like I said, the first one was a black 50 Hudson. I remember it was some sort of fast car for the day. It had 2 carburetors on it, and I know the thing just went all over the road because he gave me a ride in it. And then they ended up with a 58 Chevy, which they shared. Budgets were low in those days. And that was even the days before they really had radios that worked. So if they got radio calls from Ukiah, they had to go out to Todd's Point and park at the end of the thing for the thing to work. And then there were 2 or 3 other spots where they would work. So when they would patrol together, they would go there at a certain time and call into the office and say, you know, has anyone called? Is there anybody going on there? And then somewhere along the line, they actually ended up with 2 patrol cars, so then they could patrol separately. But they basically did most of their work together. You know, when they started doing like night patrols, which they didn't do initially, you know, they were just on call 24 hours a day, something happened, they just had to go. So when they started doing that, then I think they sometimes would alternate, the one would work nights one week, one the other. But when there was anything to investigate, they generally went out together. And then when they went to the dances or came down here to any of these celebrations, well, they'd certainly show up together and kind of backstop each other. I recall one occasion down here, there's a mention in the scrapbook about whole family of people getting arrested, but they jumped my dad. There were about 6 different guys, and they just pulled him to the ground. My father was really well coordinated, and he actually laying on the ground, knocked 4 of them cold. And Sam Costa took his club and hit the other 2 in the head and knocked him out. They hauled him all off to jail. That's part of the family that got run out of town after that occasion. But in amongst the whole thing, they were sort of like the odd couple together. You know, they continually gripe and grumble about each other, but in a lot of ways they were inseparable. Sam's background before he did that was he was a butcher. So every year we'd raise a steer, hang it up under the tree, kill it. Sam would come out, butcher it for us, cut up the paper, we'd all wrap it up together. We did those kinds of things together. Did the things with the abalones. When I was in high school, I kept the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office in abalones. My father used to come and pick them up when we were abaloning. I won't tell you how many he'd take at a time, but we'd take enough at a time to keep most of the sheriff's office in abalones. He would transport them over to partway to Ukiah, and one of the deputies would meet him on the Willits Road, and they'd take him. He'd take out his share, and he'd send the rest of them on to Ukiah to the jail, and then he'd disseminate them out. Kept me from being arrested a couple times when I was younger.
But in your defense, the limit was a lot more then.
I believe we.
Yeah, I think you were.
I think we were
right
beyond the
under
limit on
five.
those
You were
things.
right under 5.
Yeah.
But the American Legion abalone feed every year that they had at the Veterans.
Yeah.
My dad took them all in a day.
Yeah.
A lot of times with Bill Brazil watching, you know, from the thing, and we'd clean them and pound them all in the kitchen. And
Yeah, I think
fry
even
them
those
up.
days it was illegal to sell them, even at a get-together like that. And
Well, I mean, you know, James Drury and those guys had come to the feed, so
Yeah.
they were the game wardens, so.
Right, I remember that.
The only other law enforcement on the coast was probably the city police in Fort Bragg.
Yeah.
Was that Owen Habitzel, was he
Yeah.
the chief there?
Yeah, Owen Habitzel was the chief, and I think
There was a
initially-
constable too, right, though, didn't Mendocino County have a constable?
Yeah, Barth, I think was.
George Barth.
George Barth.
Yeah, he was a constable, and, you know, so it was really strange, because we had the deputies,
Yeah,
we had the Fort Bragg police, and then there was this roving constable, you know, that I always used to hear about,
Yeah.
but what he did, I never knew.
his job really was serving papers.
Papers, right?
If you
Isn't
got a
that-
divorce
Yeah.
or was a subpoena, then his job, yeah, I think he actually got paid by the
By
paper
each
package
package.
that he delivered. And other than that, I don't think he really exercised any law enforcement.
Yeah, it was really cool, we had a constable, I thought that was pretty cool.
But you know, it was a real quiet area. I think initially, when Dad went to work, there was, Owen Habitzel was the chief of police, and I think they had 2 deputies in those days. And one of those interesting stories, when my father was at the jail one day talking to them, and one of the other deputies said to Owen Habitzel about, what kind of a pistol have you got? And he goes, oh, it's, you know, Smith & Wesson .38 Special. And he said, well, could I see it? And so Owen went to pull it out of the holster. It stuck in the holster. You heard this story too?
Yeah.
It stuck in the holster because it hadn't been out of the holster in probably 20 years. And when they finally got it out, there were little bits and pieces of wood in there, and dirt, and leaves and things. It was just rusted and frozen. They actually took his deputy there 2 or 3 days to clean that thing up where it actually would work. But that was an era where, you know, it wasn't like TV today where you pulled your gun out once in a while. You know, it just wasn't done.
I can remember
Yeah.
Owen Habitzel, vision I can have of him the most is before there were stoplights in Fort Bragg, and when the mill would let out every day, Owen would be at that crosswalk.
Oh, directing traffic.
Right in the center between Redwood Avenue and
Yeah.
Main Street. He'd be out in the middle there directing traffic, letting the mill out, you know,
Right.
letting the mill guys out, and the mill guys going to work, and then the cross traffic
Yeah.
up Highway 1. So
But
he,
gave
his,
him something to
yeah,
do.
he was prominent every day at 4 o'clock, 4:50. He was, made his appearance.
Yeah. I can remember my father talking about Owen and not having a tremendously high opinion.
Nice guy.
He was a nice guy. I think when we were kids, Bill and I and Lance, Fort Bragg was full of characters.
Well, how about-
Your dads were characters.
How about Socks?
Yeah.
The guy who, Mike
Yeah.
Piata, Mike Piata.
They had the long red socks.
Yeah, he had the logger socks up,
Yeah.
like, he wore them like knickers, he'd roll his pants up with his socks.
Always had a toothpick in his mouth.
You'd always see him standing on the corner down there, you know, by the welcome inn, hanging out down there.
No place to go, nothing to do.
And they, you know, they lived a lot, there were so many single guys lived in boarding houses
Yeah.
around Fort Bragg. And they just worked in the mill.
Yeah, and I know, places like, Camp 2, and Camp 3, out of 10 Mile, I can remember, the bunkhouses out there for the fallers.
Well, it was, when you said Rockport, the one thing that I remember my grandfather saying about Rockport was, he said, yeah, he goes, all the men went off to war. He didn't, because he was the master mechanic
Yeah.
at the sawmills, so. He goes, all the men went to war, he goes, so we needed a lot of guys to work in the woods, he goes, so they brought in a lot of, and this won't sound right, but he goes, they brought in all those Okies.
Yeah.
He goes, and they started sending the Okies out to the other logging camps, he goes, and they would create such a problem in each camp, He goes, they decided they'd send them all to Rockport. And supposedly though, that was part of the thing is that they kind of concentrated these people who moved in Dust Bowl era up into Rockport there.
Yeah.
And when they left, when they when the big shutdown came after that, supposedly they took everything with them, including the floorboards.
Yeah.
You know, he said.
And they moved to Hayfork.
And they,
Hayfork. Yeah, almost everybody in Rockport was either related to or from a place called Atoka, Oklahoma. Someone gave me I think Corky Peeler gave me the whole history of that town.
oh, I'm just saying, they
And
said
they
that it
were
was
all
just
related.
absolutely wild. They were all related, and they all had a beef on Saturday night.
Yeah.
You know, had to do with a mule that got stole back in Oklahoma or something, and they would come in and cash their paycheck, get rip-roaring drunk,
Go out,
and
yeah.
commence to bite ears off.
Yeah.
You know,
Punch it out, and then Monday morning was business as usual, back at the mill.
Dave, what was the significance of getting back to Fort Bragg and kind of thinking of the Finnish community, the co-op? You have a
Yeah.
pretty good understanding of.
Yeah, actually, our family had some stock in it, but the Fort Bragg Co-op was the first co-op in California, and it may have been one of the first in the United States, and really was really put together by the Finnish community. And I think it kind of moved in around that whole egg and chicken industry, that that you were sort of at the mercy of whoever you sold the eggs to and the chickens to. So they actually formed that cooperative, and I remember that we used to save all our receipts. I don't know if your family traded there too, but a lot of us did in town. And at the end of the year, you brought all your receipts in, and they gave you like a share of stock in it. And my mother probably has some somewhere in one of the chests in the house yet from that. But everybody kind of shared in the proceeds, and at the end of the year, depending on how much money you spent there, you actually got like a rebate. And the whole idea was that it not turn a profit, and if it had a profit, you got a little piece of the action. And they had a plumbing store, they had the feed store, they bought the eggs, they bought the chickens.
They had groceries also.
Yeah, they sold groceries.
they had at one
meat
time they had a
market.
bakery. They butchered right.
Yeah.
They butchered right in the co-op store, right there. They brought cattle in there.
Yeah.
Just like they did at Mendoza's over here. And they would butcher the cattle right in the store, literally kill them in the store.
Yeah.
But was your family all connected to Sointila?
We weren't connected to Sointila, though, I know a little bit of the history there, because I worked with Oscar Ericsson's daughter at one point.
I mean, they ended up basically getting run out.
Yeah.
They got burned out of there.
That was Sointila was, for those who probably haven't heard the word, was an actual commune that a group of Finnish people put together off the South Fork of the Noyo.
Company Ranch, yeah.
Little side stream that goes back in, and that was one of the early, they were communists.
True
That was-
commune.
Yeah, and it was a true commune, and they had they had a little shop in there, and they had a blacksmith shop.
Blacksmith shop, they had chicken coops.
yeah,
They
and-
grew hay and grain, they raised wheat out there.
Yeah, and it was really a kind of a self-sufficient little community, and Oscar Ericsson his family was one of the prime movers in that. And because when I guess probably that kind of came unglued in the late 30s, when the whole anti-communist movement really took place. And
Well, the company wanted their timber too. They had
Yeah.
homesteaded there hundreds and thousands of acres of
Yeah.
virgin redwood. And the company wanted it. And the company wasn't above using hooligans from the city to drive
Oh,
people
yeah.
out. They burned them out all the time.
yeah,
They said they'd offer to buy it once. They'd offer to buy it twice. And the third time, you just didn't go to town for supplies anymore. But,
yeah, I'm surprised somebody hasn't done like a local history of that.
well, Matt Matila told me that he was there when they built the Eagles Hall. He had photos of it when Eagles Hall is a Finnish hall,
Yeah.
as is what they call Redmond's now. That was the
Yeah, it was the
Kalevala
Kalevala
Hall.
Yeah.
And the Gaslight Theater that was Runeberg Hall.
Yeah.
And so all of those big halls in Fort Bragg were all finished halls. But when the Eagles Hall was opened, there are 3 cupolas on the building. There's a small one on the right and left side, and then in the center of the building, there's a big cupola there. And Matt said, oh yeah, he goes, they flew the bear flag on that cupola, California flag. And he goes, and they flew the stars and stripes right there, he goes. But the big pole, he goes, she had the red flag on it, you know? And so these guys used to run the California flag up and the US flag, and then on the top one, they flew the big red flag, you know? And so they were they were real communists.
Yeah.
They had manifestos. They had the co-op, and the Eagles Hall, those people were that was the co-op. Those were the people. And that place had meeting every week,
Yeah.
dance every month.
Yeah, I know one of my uncles actually went to Russia in the 30s as a master farmer. He said Russians, which is another story unto itself, but the Russians promised him enormous amounts of money. He and his cousin went to Russia, and they paid them very well, but only in rubles, which they couldn't exchange or take out of the country, and then they wouldn't let them leave because they were so good at what they did. And they actually hiked out of Russia in the middle of winter through the snow and into Finland, crossed some frozen lake. But, you know,
About your dad.
yes.
What was he like as a father? And what things in his job touched him and what made him, you know, you say he was very calm and all, but there must have been times when he was angry or...
Well, I think the worst part of the job is he, you know, he not only was a deputy sheriff, but he was also the coroner. So any deaths that weren't in the hospital, you know, he had to investigate. And some of those were, you know, heart-wrenching, you know, children, I remember children drowning and things like that. Those things like that would really affect him badly. Or having to deliver the bad news that someone had been killed in a car wreck or died in the woods, which was not an uncommon occurrence, so he had to deliver those messages. Those parts were really difficult for him. I think as a father, he was kind of he sort of had that kind of stern demeanor, but he was really kind of a pussycat underneath it all. As a child, I had never been spanked except once by a babysitter. You know, he was just a real nice person, you know, a nice guy.
He was a lot of fun, he certainly was.
And again, he had a lot of fun with the job, and he really enjoyed being in the community and you know, sit on the sidewalk and talk to people for hours sometimes. Of course, the tips would come in that way too. But for him, that was a major part of his social life, was just being out there. And of course, you know, as they became more mobile and the cars became a little more dependable, I mean, he was all over and he knew everyone. I mean, it was, and he would, even if he didn't have some sort of law enforcement contact, if he drove out someplace like Albion Ridge, he'd stop and, you know, talk to the people that lived there. You know, just sort of show the flag and how you doing and what is there. And he had to, you know, I remember, you know, elderly people, he'd do the shopping for them sometimes, and you know, he'd stop by to see if they needed anything, bring things back to them. It was a lot more to the job than just arresting crooks.
How long was he deputy sheriff?
I think from, what, 55, 56 until 76, and then I think he died 2 years after that.
You retired?
Yeah, 21 years on the job, what I think it would have worked out to be.
He was so well liked and respected.
Yeah,
Everybody.
one of the nice things about growing up, and I've told my wife this, is that when you grew up in Fort Bragg, you grew up in a community. And when you had a father like mine, who everybody knew you, and as a child, you had some stature attached to that. And of course, as a teenager, it got a little rougher from the other direction. But You know, I can remember walking down the street when I was 10 years old, and probably 99% of the people I walked by knew who I was, knew me by name, would stop and talk with me. And as I got older, sometimes they'd yank me up a little short and have a little talk with me about some of my behaviors. But it was a great era to grow up in. It was a great place to live. You know, I've always loved the community and yeah.
The downtown Fort Bragg on, you know, it's like from Laurel Street to Oak Street, Franklin Street and Main Street. You know, it was a pretty incredible place because every business owner knew who you were, I know that.
Yeah.
They knew me, of course, because of my grandparents, they knew Bill too, you know, and a myriad other people, so, but your credit was good, your name was well known, you know, it was just like, if you walked into the store, it was, oh, what's your mom need, or, you know.
Yeah, you were someone, you had an identity.
That was cool.
You know, which I think that's really lacking in this day and age. And you know, I don't live in Fort Bragg now, I live in a bedroom community outside of San Francisco. And we know one set of neighbors, period. And there's no real sense of community. And when you've been in a community and you've grown up in it, when you get away from that, you miss that. But that's one thing really, when I think about Fort Bragg and when we were younger here, that's really the one thing that sticks out most in my mind is, in I guess in my heart, is that sense of community that we had. You know, if something happened to somebody, everybody turned out. If there was a tragedy, everybody turned out to help. And when it was a celebration.
Okay, I asked all the people who are from that area if they remember this particular event in Fort Bragg. You probably do, because I'm sure your dad covered that pretty well. It's when the log decks burned at the sawmill in the 50s. And all of the fir logs burned out on Noyo Point out there. Do you remember that?
I remember it happening.
Yeah. I remember because my mother and May Robbins were down there, they photographed the whole thing. You know, because my mother had a thing with your dad and Sam, you know, because she wasn't, as your dad was with Leo, with Owen Habitzel, she always, you know, she had a nickname for your dad and for Sam Costa, you know. And she always called your dad Leo the Lion.
Yeah.
And Sam, Fearless Sam, you know, and so, and I always remember, you know, sitting there and he goes, but Connie, if you need us, you'll want us, you know. And she would say, absolutely, Leo, but you know, this is like, and you know, but that was the thing, is your friend, that's how your friends were. I can remember it, you know, because my mother loved your mother dearly, you know, she was like, she considered her mentor and her friend, you know.
By then, those ladies used to go out every Friday night.
Oh, man.
I some of those episodes too, a lot of them.
They were not afraid to party.
No, they were not. Our mothers and the other ladies that they work with would go out every Friday night, basically go on a big toot, that's all you could say. And I remember my father used to have to haul them all home. It was a great era, though, it really was. But, you know, when you talk about, you know, Leo the Lion, almost anybody in Fort Bragg in those days had a nickname.
Right, exactly.
I mean, everybody had nicknames. That was
Moose
and Cocky Dodge, I remember him, and Baldy Del Rey. And just, there was something about the community that everybody that was here, that actually people knew who they were. They all had nicknames. But Fearless Sam, I think that really fit him. I mean, when his temper went up and he cooked off pretty quickly. He really was fearless, and he was not a very big man.
No, he was.
Yeah, but just a hell of a nice guy. Yeah. I don't know what else I could cover.
They covered a lot, huh?
Yeah.
But I enjoyed my childhood and my adolescence and my adulthood here in the community. And you know, it's nice to see old friends. Bill and I have been friends since we were about 5 years old. you were a little younger than we were. I just remember you as a kid.
Yeah, no, I was saying, I didn't know exactly how long it had been since I talked to you.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's like, the Ugrins were always a big part of my family, you know, just by their presence and by, well, as your dad was, you know, he had quite a reputation, so my dad was a, you know, he had his reputation
Yeah.
on his side, and they were, you know, your dad was law enforcement, my dad was the other side. You know, he's, but they weren't adversaries or anything, they were the best of friends.
Yeah.
You know, they were hunters, they shared that
Yeah, I think,
sportsman thing.
I think that was true. I mean, there were people my father arrested that, you know, the next week, you know, you'd see them together. It was
My father's
nothing
never
personal.
arrested, you know,
Yeah.
that was a good thing. He was
Yeah.
professional.
Rose?
Did he ever take you out with him?
At times he did, you know, was really frowned on, but I went out on patrols with him and, you know, a couple times on, you know, when I was young and foolish, you know, I went on a couple of recoveries where people had drowned, which were not good experiences, but my father let me do that anyway, just because he felt that was part of growing up, that if you really want to see something like that, then I'll go and take you, but, you know, when you come across someone who's, you know, been drowned for a couple of weeks, it's not a very pleasant sight, and then I got quite a lecture afterwards about what life was really about, things like that. I don't think he ever really hid anything from me about stuff like that. But there were a few times early on when he first started working, things tightened up as years went by. When he first went to work, he got to use the patrol car as a personal vehicle. I mean, my mother had a car that she used to go to work, and then we used the patrol car just to go down and go shopping and stuff with it. It was part of the process, and it became a lot more officious as time went on.
You shared memories with me of going to Utah with him, or Wolf Creek. On duty, you know, what a road.
Wolf Creek is one of these places where you go up over the top of this ridge, and it's just was a set of dirt switchbacks going down into this lumber mill, just back and forth, and on every corner there was a logging truck that would gone off. I mean, it was literally every corner somebody gone off there, and I know a couple times they actually had to go up because, you know, there were fatalities attached to that. But what a drive down into that place. You know, just going in a pickup, it was a tough one, and for people that trucked logs out of there, man, they had to have had their heart in their throat the whole time. Did you ever go up to Wolf Creek?
No.
See you shaking your head?
Oh,
It was,
the Bluff Road, you know,
Yeah.
you're riding out of there in an off-highway truck, it's clear air under the running board.
Yeah.
There's no road,
yeah, and.
no road at all. I mean, you just, passenger side, you're looking at the beach.
Yeah.
And they have, you know,
Yeah, you had to really wanted the job badly to drive a truck out of there. That's all I can say. I think every corner had a wrecked truck on it, maybe more than one. It was just an unbelievable place.
you know, well, Bendix Brakes that used to be their ad, is a couple
Yeah.
trucks coming out of Usal and Wolf Creek. They'd have a truck there with a 5-log load on it, and I would say, you think you need tough bricks? Ask the Union Lumber Company.
Yeah.
Bendix Brakes.
Well, let's thank Tom very much. And come back next month, the fourth Sunday, 3 o'clock, for another history talk. And refreshments will be served in the kitchen, so be sure to do that too. And I'm sure if you want to look at the scrapbook or
Yeah.
any of these, that Tom will be happy to
Sure.
show them to you.
Yeah, I'll put it over on the table, you can look back through it.
Okay. Thank you, Tom.
Oh, you're
very
welcome.
much.
That's been a long time since I've even seen this thing.
Great to see you.
Yeah, it's nice seeing you again, too.
Yeah.
Pretty sure, I think we're meeting all the time, so. I don't think we get that far off.
Well, it's like I remember when Kyle's uncle well too.
Who kept the scrapbook, Tom? Who created it?
You know, my mother did.
Uh-huh.
She just,
That's so great.
She had a sentimental side after all.
yeah, you know, it didn't show itself very often, if at all.
I read it, you know, through, it took me a half a day.
Yeah,
Mhm.
but I,
Was very impressed.
yeah, he really.
Oh, here it is, run him out of town. Must leave town.
So what were the consequences of not leaving town?
Nobody wants tea?
You know,
Rather be
Was like-
tea is there.
the judge, you know, because they took him in
Yeah.
kind of after hours and just sat him down and had a talk with him.
Oh, yeah.
And the judge, I think, just said, the next time you come in, and I put you in jail, you're not getting out.
Because sometimes I've had them where they're too hard and the chocolate's hard, but these were
Just melt in your mouth.
Whoa, how my grandmother told her when they lived on the First River, her mother.
You're gonna have to just run these guys out of town.
I think I
I remember, you know, it was like.
will. In here? Oh.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
He was another character.
But like I said, in those days, everybody was a character around here. I mean, it really was true. I mean, my mother is at 94, can bend over and put her hands on the ground like that. She was out 8, 10 hours a day, weeding the lawn. You know, she was still taking care of horses up until 2 years ago. Get up at 4 in the morning and feed the horses and do an hour's worth of exercise.